let's go ahead and begin our discussion on social prescribing. Okay, so I want to begin by taking you to Cambodia and imagining the days of the 1960s and the 1970s when there was the war and the US Army military went into Cambodia and put out all of these landmines as a way to kill off the people, try to slow down the advancing armies of the people of those countries. And those landmines are still there. They're still there. And people still are in danger of tripping over them and blowing themselves up or blowing limbs from their bodies up. And so I want to tell you a story about a man, actually, a scientist who went to Cambodia to do some research on antidepressants there. And he actually wanted to help bring antidepressants to Cambodia. And when he talked to the local health professionals there, they told them, he mentioned antidepressants, and they said, oh, well, geez, yeah, we have a word for that. At first, they didn't understand what he meant, how these little pills can, cause balance to the brain, and somehow that makes you happier, or it relieves you from depression. They said, we also have antidepressants, but they're not pills. For example, there was a man who was a farmer, a rice farmer, and he had the unfortunate incident that he tripped over a landmine, now years and years later after the war. And so, the people of Cambodia, for example, and in Vietnam, they're still suffering from this, as you can see in this little boy here. And thanks to these signs, they can avoid, the danger of the mines being there. But there was a story of a man who tripped over a landmine and lost his leg, like this little boy. And although the local doctors there were able to give him a prosthetic limb, he still was suffering from a lot of depression and uncertainty about the future, as you can imagine. So what they did for this man when they noticed that he was depressed is the community got together and they said, well, what can we do for him? He's clearly depressed because he lost his leg, and although he now has the limb, that helps, but he can't do the same work that he used to do. So they thought, well, why don't we buy him a cow? And why don't we train him to be a dairy farmer? Because now he can do this work more easily than being out in the rice fields. And so the community got him a cow. And this really did lift his spirits. He took up dairy farming and he recovered from his depression. And so when the people of Cambodia considered what is an antidepressant, first of all, their language didn't even have terms like that. When they considered that, they said, yes, antidepressants are these things. The community involvement that actually helps people to solve their real problems that cause them depression. In our Western culture, our Western sense of mental health, we rely heavily on antidepressants. But the problem with antidepressants is that it's a very abstract notion that says there's a mental imbalance in your mind. There's a chemical imbalance in your mind, like let's say a lack of serotonin levels that can help to balance your brain. But that's so, it's like, okay, so then I just need to balance that and everything will be okay. But what about the things let's say that you were to take pills and now you do have a restoration of balance chemically in your mind. But if you recover in that way, what about the conditions in your life that lead you to depression? Underlying problems that don't get resolved with the brain balancing. For example, the things that actually cause you pain, the things that lead you to anxiety and depression, like unemployment, loneliness, you know, many, many other things that we've been actually discussing for the last few sessions, childhood trauma, etc. So, what about those things? What's the prescription for those things? When I was 12 years old, 12 or something like that, 12 going on 13, in seventh grade, I went through a depression. It's kind of a mysterious depression. It could have been caused by things happening in my life with my family. Um, it could have been the effects of Kurt Cobain killing himself, and I was a big fan of Nirvana and Kurt Cobain. The point is that it settled into me, and I began to seek help. And finally, after a few weeks of seeking some mental health on my own, my parents, I talked about it with a counselor who finally got around to meeting with me, and obviously notified my parents. And then that same night, my parents took me to a psychologist, some kind of therapist. And the therapist session lasted maybe, if I remember correctly, you never remember things 100% well. But I remember it was a very kind of dim lit room. And the therapist, she was very nice, and it only lasted about 15 minutes. And then suddenly my parents told me, the problem you're having is you have a chemical imbalance. You have a chemical imbalance, and you will be prescribed medication to help restore your chemical imbalance. And I was prescribed some disipramine. And they said, and tonight we're going to take you to a hospital where you will be treated. So in a span of 30 minutes, suddenly I was prescribed medication. After the 15-minute meeting, and however long it took after that, I was prescribed medication, and I was on my way to a facility, some kind of mental hospital to help people. And we went there that night, and suddenly I spent the night there. And I ended up staying at the hospital for 2 weeks. And this disrupted my something really fun that I was doing in school at the time. I was actually involved in a school musical at that time. And I played the role of Elvis. And I did my own imitation of Elvis Presley, which was people really liked. And of course, it was nothing like Andy Kaufman's great Elvis impersonation. But so that was disrupted. I ended up leaving that, and somehow, even though that beautiful thing was happening in my life, I still felt depressed for some reason. So I ended up going to the hospital, and unfortunately, there I was with other children no. Because I was 12, I was put into the room with the teenagers, into the ward with the teenagers, when I really should have been put with children, and smaller children. And that's not the only time in my life in which that same thing kind of was a mistake that either happened to me or made on my part too. I was also originally trained to teach elementary education as a profession. But when I first got my teaching job, I ended up teaching middle school, and that was a mistake because middle schoolers are a lot more difficult to manage than elementary school kids, and I should have taught elementary school when I had the chance rather than middle school. Anyways, that was now many years ago. That was when I first started teaching about 16 years ago. But this time, I ended up going to the hospital, staying with the teenagers, and those teenagers were none of them were there for depression. They were all there for drugs, hard drugs that they were doing, and even minor crimes that they had made, and going to this hospital, instead of perhaps another sort of juvenile detention center. And it was my first exposure to kids having done drugs, and every day I learned the story of their lives doing that. And I remember even feeling kind of a little inadequate. Well, I'm not here for these drugs, I'm just here for depression. And unfortunately, when I left that hospital, one of the negative side effects was that I became curious about drugs. And that set off a lower period in my life, kind of a fog, when I did start to experiment with drugs early on. Fortunately, I got out of that quickly because my mother was smart enough to disconnect me from that, remove me from that, and reconnect me to my roots in Bolivia. And she sent me away for a year or two to live with her sister and brother-in-law, so I can kind of get away from the bad environment. And that reconnection to many beautiful things that I was able to enjoy in Bolivia at that time, which I won't mention, a lot of details, helped a lot. So I tell my story in a way to say that it was kind of misguided to send me right away to the hospital, to prescribe right away the medication, without the person that I spoke with asking me what was wrong with me. In a 15-minute appointment, there was no discussion of who are you, what matters to you, what is your life like, what are your parents like, what are you going through in school, when do you feel the most sad, when did you start? None of that. Imagine, I just was taken to a hospital, and I don't know the motivation. Was it to earn money, bring a kid in right as soon as possible to bring some income to this hospital? Was it to sell some drugs like antidepressants, like cypramine? Did I appear worse than I realized? Who knows what happened? So it didn't lead to very many good things after that. And although there at the hospital it wasn't super traumatic, but it was very much a strong impression was put on my mind that didn't need to be put there. So you see, today we're talking about social prescribing. And social prescribing is stepping outside of this dominant practice in our culture that is changing, more and more over time. I mean, this happened to me, over, I don't know, when I was 12. I'm 38 now, but the same idea is still there. The idea is still there that the problem with depression, depression is just a chemical imbalance that can easily be fixed with drugs. But when you do that, and that's all you're doing, that will help. But there are other factors that cause anxiety and depression that we've been talking about now for the many weeks now. And so none of that is getting addressed, And so fortunately then, we have this new movement now called social prescribing that was founded by a British man a doctor named Sam Everington, who's a general practitioner. One time he had a patient that came and was telling him about his problems, and Dr. Everington said, well, why don't I refer you to a social worker. And the patient said, I don't need a social worker. He said, literally, I need a fucking social worker's wage. um, so, in other words, I have a deeper problem. I'm broke. I'm unemployed. This is what's making me suffer, you know? And so he started to realize that we shouldn't ask people, what's the matter with you? We should ask people, what matters to you? What is it that you need? What is it that you are lacking on a holistic level? Do you feel lonely? Do you feel, is there trauma that you're experiencing, that you're recovering from, you're dealing with? Are there other economic issues that are affecting your life? Um, so when you get the whole picture, then you know that you can do more than just prescribe a pill. I'll go a little deeper into the antidepressants in a moment, but the important thing is that we have to meet people's emotional needs, okay, and we have to start to understand that antidepressants are not the only thing that lifts depressions. So social prescribing was kind of invented or founded by Sam Everington. He decided that in his clinic, he invited, eventually there was over 20 local community organizations that had everything that ranged from like helping people find employment to pottery making to gardening to volunteer work to maybe even there was meditation there. Just envision a clinic where it's kind of like a community center where all of these different resources are available, and a doctor can prescribe to somebody, you seem to be dealing with some loneliness. Would you like to, why don't I, connect you with a group of people who you can have some social engagement with and who you can do some fun activities with? And so some of the things that he prescribed was, for example, this wonderful community gardening program in London. There was, today I'm cursing a lot. I hardly do this actually. There was an alley in London called Dog Shit Alley. And Dog Shit Alley was called Dog Shit Alley because that's what it was, literally. And as part of the doctor found a way to get some funding for these people that were suffering from depression to get together and turn that alley into a park, turn that alley into, bring a garden into that alley so that as people walk through there, they could enjoy flowers and nature and gardening, a beautiful garden being there. And of course, people who had never known each other were all kind of suddenly lumped into this program, who had no idea how to garden, didn't know anything about planting or seeds. One of them was a former mental health practitioner who became depressed. Another one was a homeless person living on a bus. Another one was, immigrants from Bangladesh with PTSD and going through all types of social and economic problems. These group of people just got together and they said, look, make a garden. Here are the tools. Figure it out. And the experiment was very successful because they eventually learned how to plant and garden. They eventually made a beautiful, beautiful garden park there that when the people walked by there, they were so thankful to them. They even would donate money, spontaneously. Look, here's some money. Why don't you plant some more flowers here? They started by planting daffodils. And those people also had the opportunity to plan, problem solve, but to get to know each other. And together they ended up helping each other in their own individual problems and became best friends for life. Even after the program ended, they still had the connections. So what did this social prescribing program do? This social prescription of making the community garden. What it did was it fulfilled two things that these people were being disconnected from. One was social connections. It gave them an opportunity to have social connections. And as we've discussed before, that is a very important factor for your mental well-being. You need to have the right social connections, as many as possible. It prolongs life. Many people die early because they are lonely, because they close themselves off from society. So they had an opportunity to reconnect socially with people, and they also got to reconnect with nature. You know, living in the city of London, what opportunities do you have for nature? Not much at all. But touching the earth, planting the seeds, watering the seeds, putting your hands into the earth, seeing the plants grow, learning about them, nurturing them, that is so healing. That is so uplifting for the mind. It's now, there is research that shows how it helps to relieve anxiety and depression. And we talked about reconnection to nature not long ago. So the social prescribing then did so much more than just what medication can do for people. Okay, and one of the last things I'll say, before getting to your comments, is that we don't have too much research on social prescribing and on thinking outside of medication when it comes to mental health, because the pharmaceutical companies, they spend all their money on researching drugs because that's how they make money. They don't make money if you research, how good nature is for you. There hasn't been large amounts of research on social prescribing because they're not going to profit off of that. So those people whose job it is to help relieve your depression, the pharmaceutical companies, they don't test. They don't use their power and resources to look at mental health holistically, because they only care about the things that will give them money, like the drugs that they'll manufacture and sell at enormous prices here in the United States. Just in Canada, one drug will cost 11 times less than a drug right across the bridge in Vermont, for example. We're talking a 10-minute drive. Your medications will cost 11 times less. So, so it's a big disservice that we're going through with those drugs. And the other thing too is that a lot of times when antidepressants are tested before they are allowed to be put on the market, they do a combination of tests. They prescribe a control group the drug, and they prescribe another group a placebo, telling them that is the same drug. And the way that they know that the drug works is if the people who took the actual drug have, better results than the ones who took the placebo. But guess what? Usually 50% of the people who take the placebo say that they are better. So, and maybe, not 50, sorry, maybe like less than 50. So then it's only just a few percentage points that are in favor of the drug actually effectively working. Because that's the other side to antidepressants that we don't hear about much, is that in large parts they are placebos to people. People take pills, there's a lot of research on that, antidepressants that are actually placebos, and they feel fine. They feel that it works. And sometimes the only reason why the antidepressant works is because it is a placebo, not necessarily because it's doing the biochemical work of raising serotonin levels or something like that. So even the way that it is manufactured and tested is a sham in some aspects, and it's important to consider. And I hope that in the United States we will move into a new wave of wellness that is about social prescribing, and we will have the opportunities to go to general practitioners and not only go there to talk about physical problems or mental problems, but talk about our whole lives, and that place be a place that can connect you to other people, to meaningful activities, to meditation and yoga, to reconnecting with nature, to helping people find employment, training people for employment. all of that contributes to mental and physical health. And health practitioners, though they may be swamped with the work that they do, they can employ a social prescribing um, agent link that can help to do this work for the community. I would love to see more of that in the United States. I feel like that's only happening mainly in Europe. But maybe you all in the chat can tell me if you've heard of social prescriptions happening in the United States as well. So let's go ahead now and take a look at your comments. Let's start over here at, well, many people have joined. Let's just catch up. Lalit Mohan is here, also known as Luis. He says, Namaskar, friend. Namaskar, buddy. And Peggy here says, good morning. Hi, Peggy. It's so great to have you here. I'm looking forward to our meeting and also announcing your the great work you've been doing at our online meditation next time after our meeting. And Karen says, shared on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you. Namaskar from Woodbridge. That's our dear sister Jayati. Namaskar. Ritva was in Sweden saying namaskar. Welcome. And Hitendra, I'm offering free hypnotherapy sessions to gain practice for my licensing. So email, there's his email there. Thank you for offering that, brother. I lost that. Where is it? There it is. Okay, so feel free to contact him for some free hypnotherapy sessions. Shannon says, Namaskar from Alexandria, Virginia. I would like to purchase your music. Please share link and info. Thank you. I'm happy to do that. Why don't I see if I can do that right now? Do I have a link to my album, Serenade to the Universe, which you heard in the Kirtan? Let's see. Yes. There you go. Thank you, Shannon. I'm putting it now on Facebook. And Hitendra says, my experience with antidepressants is that over the 8 years that I was on them, I spiraled ever more deeply down into my depression. It was not until I found meditation and began to living to improve my life and the lives of others that I began to rise out of prescription drugs, pot, and alcohol use. Thank you, brother. It's when we start to learn about the lack of, the deficiencies of antidepressants and the lack of holistic awareness in mental health of all the multiple factors that cause anxiety and depression that have nothing to do, that can be fixed, that can be addressed without antidepressants. When we learn about that, it can hurt us. You can say, what the hell happened to me? Why did I have to take all these drugs? You know, so you know, that's something that we may have to deal with. And the important thing is that we learn what's beyond. And that's why it's so important to be aware of different movements like social prescribing, because they address things that the antidepressants could never do, and they really actually help to solve people's actual problems. The story that I told you about the cow was a perfect example of social prescription. The community gave the man who had lost his limb a cow to help rebuild his life. And so you see, that was addressing a real need that he had. Okay? He was able to find new work with the cow, and then, who knows, love, taking care of his new cow. You know, a sense of communion with nature, as, you know, the cow being nature in that sense. So thank you for sharing, brother. Shannon says, we as a nation we as a nation fail to treat mental illness appropriately. The brain is an organ of the body, and an illness of the brain should be given the same consideration of treatment as other organs of the body without the stigma that goes with it. That is also true. There's stigma around mental health. Um, Mental health is viewed as non-real. My mother is from that generation where, when she was young, nobody cared about if she was sad or feeling depressed. They just thought she was being naughty, you know. So thankfully, we are overcoming that. And movements like social prescription, I think, are the important elements that need to be brought into that discussion. Vistara Jayati says, there as Vistara Circle, sometimes people hide their emotions, especially after trauma. Especially after trauma or an event that caused so much heartache. Sometimes with depression, a person can hide it so well, and this makes it so hard for them to express their emotions. Antidepressants is a temporary relief from depression. Like what you are saying, it's better to be in nature, to be with people. That will help lift you up and finding a healthy outlet to express those feelings. Yes, yes. Now there could be a place for antidepressants, but it's not the only thing that should be focused on, is a larger point that we're making. And maybe we're even, and yes, we're making the bolder assertion that more can be done than just antidepressants. Okay? So we should explore those other strategies as well, and with a lot of energy. So thank you, Jayati. Thank you for sharing. Peggy says, thanks for the topic. Thanks for the topic. It's a reminder for me to reach out to friends and family more. Great. Jayati says, social prescribing is more likely to save a person from the darkness of their mind than taking drugs. I agree. Opportunities to connect with other people, whatever, the whole, like meetup.com can be like a social prescribing site where you can socially prescribe yourself, right? What do I need? I need people. Let me go connect with people who do things that I also find interesting, like communities that do art together, communities that meditate together, like us, communities that practice yoga together, that paint together, volunteer opportunities. Social prescribing, I think, should really also help people connect with doing different forms of service. Because the problem is, because what helped those people in London who created a park out of the alley, is that before they came to do the gardening work as a service to the city, before that, they were always just focused on themselves. Every day waking up to my problems, every day going somewhere to talk about my problems, obsessing over my problems. When you have a lot of problems, the solution is not always to just dwell on them, keep talking about them. The solution is to help other people with their problems, believe it or not. Help the community. If the community does well, you will do well. If the society does well, you will do well. So this social prescription of doing the gardening work was doing a service. And when we do service, we get a lot of joy out of that. Although our service should be selfless, but we get a lot of internal joy. And some yogis say that on days that they have spent the day doing service, that their meditation is even more blissful. So that's a nice little anecdotal thing that also shouldn't be your motivation. Service should be selfless. And but sometimes they are needed as forms of prescription. Sometimes you need to do them because you actually are suffering. And it will help to relieve that suffering. Hatendra says, balancing of diet, which includes food, music, media, and people, can end just depressive feelings. Absolutely. So the more we can reconnect with those options, the better. And then over on YouTube, I see Jamila says, Namaskar, everyone. Namaskar, Jamila. Noelia says, capitalism and racism. Tell us what you mean by that, Noelia. I think capitalism and racism causes mental depression, mental health problems. That would be another good topic for us. Although we've been talking about that, how this capitalistic society of consumption that we live in leads to mental health problems. It makes us feel that we are always lacking something. So we've talked about that. Racism will greatly cause depression. Racism causes people of color sometimes to be invisible, you know, and causes people of color to feel displaced, that they don't have a place in society, that they are not an individual, that they are the whole race. They are all the stereotypes of the race in that being, in that person. And that can lead to serious mental health problems. So thank you for your comments, everybody. If there are no more, we will begin to close. Let's do announcements, and then maybe I can touch back. Actually, we can just go ahead and close here. I want to thank you all for a very lively discussion. Why don't we meet in the Vistara Circle group for more discussion? Any more comments on social prescribing? Okay, the link is, I'll put it in the chat here. Okay, so here is the link on YouTube, and here is the link on Facebook. We're going to read one last comment. Lalit Mohan says, thank you for sharing your story, brother. You are living proof to the benefits of meditation and surrendering to the Supreme. Oh, thank you, brother. Yeah, I hadn't told that story of when I was 12. And you know what's something really nice that I remember? I'll just take another minute to finish that story. When I left the hospital, I came back. And it was just a few days now before we were going to debut the musical that I was in school. And I remember when I walked in, I'd been away for 2 weeks from school, and I was back, and I went after school to the rehearsal. And I remember, or maybe I went to the rehearsal first before actually going to the school day earlier that day. I remember as soon as I walked into the auditorium where we were rehearsing, all of the kids, they were so sweet. They all swarmed up to me. They rushed up to me, and they, said my name, and they were like, Gustavo, you're back. Where have you been? It was so sweet. I didn't know even at the time how to handle something like that. And they said, are you still in the play? Are you still gonna? And then my teacher, the choir director, she asked, so do you still want to do it? I said, yeah. And they said, okay. So I did it, and it was so much fun performing that. Getting to be Elvis and doing the very risque hip dance, which I added my own inflections to, because I really didn't even know Elvis all that well then. So that was a lot of fun, and that closing part of when the kids all came up to me and hovered around me and gave me all this love was really the kind of things that heal people from depression. And, I really wasn't depressed after that. Maybe it was that moment that broke some spell. And if we could do that more for people, if we could take our friends who are depressed and just surround them by other people and give them a big hug, a big group hug, and listen to them and be there for them, I think that that goes a long way because that's how tribal societies heal depression. The whole community gathers to be there for the person who's ailing.